Aldborough-on-Sea wasn't the kind of place that ever made the evening news. It was a sleepy coastal town defined by screaming gulls, weathered gray slate roofs, and a salty harbor perpetually thick with the scent of diesel and brine. Down on the high street, life moved at a neighborly, unhurried pace where everyone knew whose mischievous dog had slipped its leash long before the bewildered owner even realized it was gone. Julian Ashcombe had spent his entire life rooted right here, and for the past 3 lonely years, it had just been him and his young daughter under that same familiar roof. His workshop sat tucked away near the very end of the pier road, a low, sturdy timber building that always smelled deliciously of fresh varnish and clean cedar shavings. Julian spent his days doing what he loved best, painstakingly restoring old, battered sailing boats, the kind that everyone else had long since written off as beyond saving. There was something deeply therapeutic, almost meditative, about taking a hull left to rot by time and neglect, and bringing it back to life plank by plank. It made a quiet, steady kind of sense to him in a world where most things didn't make sense anymore. Ever since Isla passed away, Julian had grown remarkably adept at making sense of complicated things with his own hands. Unfortunately, the rest of life, the messy, emotional, day-to-day unpredictability of parenting, was still something he hadn't quite figured out how to sand smooth. Nora was 8 years old now. She had inherited her late mother's stubbornly expressive chin along with her father's thoughtful, quiet habit of silently taking in an entire room before she ever uttered a single word. She was undeniably clever, sharper and far more observant than most kids her age. Yet, the stubborn letters on a page still insisted on scrambling themselves whenever she tried to read, prompting her concerned teacher to gently suggest, twice already, that a specialized tutor might be a wise investment before she transitioned to secondary school and catching up became exponentially harder. It was Julian's practical older sister, Freya, who ultimately took the initiative and placed the advertisement. Julian barely had a spare moment to eat a proper lunch on most days, let alone spend hours screening potential tutors. So, when Freya slid a neat folder across his cluttered kitchen table one evening, featuring 3 carefully vetted names, phone numbers, and an email reply already sitting proudly at the top, Julian simply nodded, signed off on her top recommendation, and trudged right back out to the boat waiting for him in the yard. V. Marlowe, the email had read. There was no photograph attached, just a short, thoroughly professional paragraph detailing a solid background in literacy support, accompanied by a polite note mentioning that she had recently moved back to the area after being away for several years. Absolutely nothing about the inquiry struck Julian as unusual. He hadn't even bothered to say the name out loud before giving his casual approval. Freya handled the rest of the communication, coordinated the schedule, and even unlocked the front door for that very first tutoring session while Julian was still up to his elbows in linseed oil 3 streets away. In fact, he missed that initial meeting entirely. By the time he finally trudged home that evening, Nora was already perched at the kitchen table with an open workbook spread out before her, chattering excitedly about someone named Miss Marlowe with a fiery enthusiasm she hadn't shown for any homework assignment in over a year. "She doesn't make me feel stupid at all?" Nora beamed, happily swinging her legs back and forth beneath her chair. "She says I don't read wrong. She says I just read differently." Hearing that, Julian offered a soft, genuine smile, affectionately ruffled her curly hair, and didn't give the matter much more thought. Tutors came and went after all. The only thing that truly mattered was that his bright little girl had come home looking lit up from within instead of defeated. And for a weary man who measured most days by how many tiny, metaphorical fires he had managed to put out, that simple victory felt like more than enough. It wasn't until 3 sessions later that Julian actually laid eyes on the mysterious tutor. He had managed to come home early that afternoon because a crucial engine part hadn't arrived on time, leaving the boat half-finished in the yard and granting him the exceptionally rare gift of a free afternoon at home. He let himself in quietly, automatically kicking off his muddy boots at the door out of sheer habit, and immediately heard voices drifting from the living room before he even caught a glimpse of anyone. It was Nora's voice, light, relaxed, and entirely unguarded. Interwoven with it was another voice, low, warm, accompanied by a soft, musical laugh at the end of a sentence that landed directly in Julian's chest, echoing deep inside him long before his sluggish mind could process why. He froze dead in his tracks in the narrow hallway. He sternly told himself it was nothing, just a tired, overworked man hearing a haunting ghost of something long buried beneath the years. He had barely managed 4 hours of sleep the night before, and a broken mechanical part was sitting uselessly in the back of his van. His exhausted brain was simply playing tricks on him, yet he didn't move an inch. He stood there in the quiet hallway a fraction of a second longer than he intended, listening intently to a total stranger patiently walking his daughter through a difficult sentence, and felt something deep inside his soul, something he hadn't allowed to shift or breathe in 3 full years, stir ever so slightly out of place. By the time he finally took a breath and stepped into the doorway, she was already gathering her coat, her back turned to him as her dark hair fell loose over the collar of her jacket. He caught only a fleeting glance of her profile before she quickly ducked into the kitchen to say a quick goodbye to Freya, who had been keeping watch by the door. "Dad's home early," Nora announced brightly, completely delighted as if this mundane detail were breaking news worth celebrating. "Barely caught her," Julian muttered under his breath, speaking more to himself than to anyone else in the room. That night, long after Nora had drifted off to sleep, Julian sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the tutoring agreement Freya had signed, his thumb absent-mindedly tracing the crisp edge of the paper without actually reading a single word. "Ve Marlowe." He rolled the name around in his mind the exact same way you turn over an unfamiliar word in a language you used to speak with total fluency before letting it slip away over the years. The name felt intimately familiar in its visual shape, yet completely foreign in its sound. He firmly reminded himself once more that it was nothing more than a bizarre coincidence. A voice that happened to bear a striking resemblance to a long-forgotten memory. Nothing solid, nothing real. And yet, when Freya casually mentioned in passing that the new tutor happened to be free again on Thursday afternoon, Julian found himself doing something he hadn't done in longer than he cared to admit. He deliberately cleared his schedule for the afternoon, carving out time just to make sure he was home. Thursday rolled enshrouded in a typical blanket of gray, persistent drizzle, the kind of gloomy weather Alborough wore like a second skin most of the year without ever complaining. Julian locked up the workshop at 3:30, whispering to himself that he was only heading home because Nora genuinely enjoyed having him around, refusing to look too closely at any other underlying motives. He was standing in the kitchen when the doorbell finally rang. Naturally, it was Nora who won the race to the front door, flinging it wide open with that unbridled, infectious joy she reserved exclusively for people she had already decided to love. "Ms. Marlowe," she chimed. In the next heartbeat, Julian stepped out into the hallway just as the woman on the doorstep lowered her wet umbrella, and for one long, breathless second, neither of them managed to say a single word. She looked older, of course. Time had a way of leaving its gentle mark on everyone, and 11 long years would do that to anyone. But there was no mistaking her. It was Vivian Marlowe. She possessed the exact same steady, piercing eyes that used to hold his captive across a quiet university library table until the strict closing hour forced them out. She had the exact same endearing habit of gently tucking a stray lock of dark hair behind her left ear whenever she was hesitating over what to say next. "Julian," she finally whispered, her voice carefully controlled, as if uttering his name might cause it to shatter into pieces right there in the air. "You're Ve Marlowe." "I go by Vivi now. I honestly didn't think—" She abruptly stopped talking, glanced down at a curious Nora standing nearby, and quickly recalibrated her thoughts. I didn't put the pieces together. Ashcombe is a remarkably common family name around these parts, and Freya handled all the arrangements. I genuinely had no idea whose daughter I was tutoring until I walked right into your kitchen last week. It was, in its own quiet, understated way, a far smaller and more fragile reveal than either of them might have scripted if they had been given the luxury of choice. There was no theatrical unmasking, no dramatic fireworks. Just two bruised souls who had once meant the absolute world to each other, standing awkwardly in a drafty hallway with a very confused 8-year-old child standing right between them, both desperately trying to remember how to breathe normally again. Nora, acutely sensing the heavy undercurrents vibrating through the adult silence, tugged gently on the hem of Vivi's sleeve. "Are we still doing our reading game today?" "Of course we are, sweetheart," Vivi replied, recovering her composure first as she instinctively dropped gracefully to Nora's eye level with practiced warmth. "Go grab your book from the table. I'll be right there with you." Nora scampered off eagerly down the hall, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet corridor once more. 11 turbulent years compressed awkwardly into 3 feet of narrow space. "I looked everywhere for you," Julian said softly, breaking the silence. "After Edinburgh, I wrote letters for months. I wrote back to you." Vivi's voice suddenly caught in her throat, thick with emotion. "Every single letter. I mailed them straight to the flat on Corbett Street." Julian went completely rigid. "We moved out that August. My father sold the whole place while I was still away finishing my final semester. He never even bothered to tell me until the ink was dry." He slowly shook his head in bitter disbelief as the painful puzzle pieces finally slid into alignment. A whole 11 years too late. "I genuinely thought you stopped writing because you decided I wasn't worth the distance. And I thought the exact same thing about you," Vivi whispered, tears shimmering in her eyes. "When nothing ever came back, I told myself silence was answer enough." Neither of them spoke for a long, poignant moment. There was no bitter anger lingering between them. Instead, it was something far quieter and much sadder. The specific, lingering ache of a decade spent grieving the wrong ending to a broken story. Over the weeks that followed, those Thursday afternoons slowly stopped being exclusively about Nora's reading games, even though the lessons themselves continued precisely as they should. Julian miraculously found valid reasons to be hanging around the house for the final 20 minutes of every session, bustling about to put the kettle on the stove or pretending to meticulously check the mail. For her part, Vivi stopped packing up her things and rushing out the door quite as quickly as she used to. They didn't always rehash the ghosts of their past. Most of the time, they simply talked about ordinary, grounding things. The endless harbor renovations the local council kept delaying, a stubborn wooden boat Julian was restoring for a retired schoolteacher, or a prestigious small university press-up in Scotland that had recently offered Vivi a permanent research fellowship, a golden opportunity, the kind of career-defining break she would have leapt at without a single second of hesitation 5 years ago. She hadn't answered their offer yet. Julian deliberately didn't ask her why. He had a sneaking suspicion he already half knew the answer, and quite frankly, he wasn't ready to hear it confirmed out loud. Not yet, at least not while everything between them still felt as fragile and breakable as it had that very first evening in the hallway. Freya noticed the shift long before either of them had the courage to put it into words. "You're humming?" she accused Julian one evening, crossing her arms over her chest with an unmistakable, triumphant smirk. "You literally never hum." "I am not humming." "Julian, you've been softly humming around the house for 3 solid weeks." He didn't bother denying it a second time. There wasn't much point in arguing with undeniable facts. Yet, it was little Nora who ultimately voiced the exact thing neither adult had dared to let themselves say aloud. During her tutoring sessions, Nora had taken up a habit of drawing little illustrations, proudly referring to them as story breaks. One Thursday afternoon, before Julian could blink or stop her, she slid a fresh drawing right across the kitchen table. It depicted 3 distinct figures standing happily together on a sandy beach, holding hands under a bright sun. With total childish innocence and zero self-consciousness, she had carefully labeled them, Dad, me, Vivi. Vivi went entirely still, staring down at the piece of paper for a beat too long. Julian watched her facial expression very carefully, not out of shock, but searching for that familiar flicker of sudden panic he half expected to surface. It was the quiet fear of a prestigious academic fellowship sitting unanswered up in Scotland, threatening to pull her away toward a life that had only just begun to piece itself back together, demanding more from her than she was ready to give. "That's a really wonderful drawing, Nora," Vivi finally said, her voice sounding noticeably thinner and more fragile than usual. That night, after Nora had finally gone off to sleep, Julian found Vivi still lingering at the kitchen table, the child's innocent drawing resting quietly between them like an unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. "You haven't given them your answer yet, have you?" he asked gently. "About Edinburgh?" "No," she admitted softly, refusing to meet his gaze. "I haven't told them anything yet." "Vivi, please, don't," she interrupted, her tone not unkind, just overwhelmingly exhausted. "Not tonight, Julian. I need to process this properly. Not because of what happened to us 11 years ago, but because of what is happening right here, right now. If I decide to stay, I need it to be for all the right reasons, not just because I'm terrified of losing something good a second time." Julian nodded slowly, understanding far more than he put into words. He didn't pressure her. He had learned the hard way, through years of regret, what happens when people make desperate promises before they are truly ready to keep them. But as she gathered her coat that evening, hesitating just a fraction of a second too long beside the front door, Julian understood something profound. Whatever choice she ultimately made, it wouldn't be rushed, and it wouldn't be made purely for his benefit. She was going to choose for herself first. And somehow that realization made him trust her entirely. The strict deadline for the fellowship reply arrived on a Tuesday. Vivi mentioned it to him in passing, speaking in that casual tone people adopt when talking about a massive life choice they've already half decided on inside their own heads, but haven't yet found the courage to speak plainly. A specific date circled in red ink, a formal reply overdue. A door that would inevitably swing shut on its own if she simply chose to do nothing. True to form, she didn't show up for Thursday's scheduled tutoring session that week. Instead, she sent a brief, apologetic text message saying she needed a few days of quiet space. Nora was naturally disappointed, though not entirely devastated. She had grown to trust Vivi enough to genuinely believe she wouldn't just vanish. Julian, however, wasn't nearly as certain, and he loathed how much that gnawing uncertainty cost him in peace of mind. This time, he didn't chase after her. He had spent 11 full years learning the hard way that desperate chasing never once brought her back any faster. It only ever left him standing alone in doorways that had already slammed shut. So instead, he did the only productive thing he knew how to do with an unbearable emotional weight. He walked straight out to the workshop and threw himself into his work. He was 3 days deep into putting the finishing touches on the schoolteacher's classic boat, rhythmically sanding the wooden hull smooth under the stark, bright glare of the workshop lights, when he heard the heavy front door creak open. Vivi stood silently in the entranceway, her hair damp from the relentless rain, wearing the exact same coat and carrying the exact same careful, steady expression in her eyes. In one hand, she held a thick white envelope, completely unopened. "I turned it down," she said firmly, before he could even find his voice to ask. "Edinburgh. I mailed my final response back to them this morning." Julian slowly set his piece of sandpaper down on the workbench. Why? Because for 11 years, I lied to myself, convincing myself that I left because staying never felt like a real choice, she confessed, stepping deeper into the fragrant sanctuary of cedar and varnish. My mother's illness, my father's collapsing business, everything just happened to me. I spent a terribly long time playing the victim of my own life. She took another step forward, letting the familiar scent of the workshop settle warmly around her. This time around, I wanted to actually make a choice of my own free will, and I choose this life right here. Not because I'm terrified of losing you again, but because I'm finally not afraid of it anymore. Julian slowly crossed the open floor between them, moving deliberately to give her every single opportunity to stop him if she wished, though she made no move to do so. I should have looked much harder for you, he whispered, closing the remaining distance. After the letters stopped coming, I took the path of least resistance and believed the easiest story instead of trusting you enough to ask. We were only 23, Vivi murmured, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. We were too young to know how to ask the hard questions. But we aren't 23 anymore. No, he agreed, as the smallest, brightest smile finally broke through his stoic expression. We certainly aren't. It was Nora, ironically, who properly witnessed the culmination of it all. She arrived at the workshop alongside Freya to drag Julian out for dinner, only to catch her father and her beloved tutor standing uncomfortably close together in the golden sawdust light. They weren't saying a single word to each other. They were simply standing together in comfortable silence, the way two people do when 11 long years of an unfinished conversation have finally run their exhausting course. The weeks that followed didn't magically rearrange themselves into some sweeping, cinematic drama. There were no grand, sweeping gestures, no cheering crowds gathering to applaud a romantic reunion, no sudden stroke of fortune or public reckoning. Just a series of small, deliberate, beautiful choices made consciously, one day at a time. Vivi continued tutoring Nora religiously on Thursdays, though she now routinely stayed behind for dinner afterward. Julian successfully finished restoring the schoolteacher's boat and immediately rolled a fresh frame into place for the next project. Freya mercifully stopped being smug about the whole situation. Mostly, at least, on a crisp, clear evening in early autumn, the three of them walked down toward the harbor together. Nora was skipping joyfully ahead, clutching a brown paper bag of chips, while Vivi walked right beside Julian, her hand naturally slipping into his without either of them making a dramatic production out of the moment. The tide was rolling in slow and steady against the wooden pilings, the moored boats knocking softly and rhythmically against the pier. For the very first time in longer than Julian could accurately measure, the dull, familiar ache that had permanently resided in his chest since Isla's death, quiet, constant, never truly gone, wasn't fighting for space anymore. It sat comfortably alongside something entirely new. Not replacing the past, but walking right beside it. Nora suddenly spun around on her heel to wave them urgently forward, the late afternoon sunlight catching the bright edge of her happy grin. Vivi glanced sideways up at Julian with the exact same steady, unwavering eyes that had once captured his heart across a quiet university library table, 11 years and a lifetime ago. It's really, truly you, he murmured again, his voice softer this time, carrying no trace of disbelief, only a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. After all these years, I'm not going anywhere, Vivi promised softly, squeezing his hand. Not this time. Together, they walked onward toward the shimmering water, completely unhurried, with an entire evening stretched out before them. For once in his life, Julian finally allowed himself to believe that some broken stories didn't need grand rescues after all. They simply needed enough time, enough patience, and enough quiet courage to find their own way back to where they truly belonged.